Yeah, welcome everybody. For those who are new to us, I'm Mark Weathington, director here at the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. Glad to have you all here. Looks like we've got a good group today. I do want to mention the Southeastern Plant Symposium, which will be online on June 12th. You do have to register for that. It's going to be a fantastic program. We have got some of the top experts in the world on different aspects of plants, including Fergus Garrett from Great Dixter, who worked with Christopher Lloyd. He is a genius in terms of putting plants together and really creating not only incredible plant combinations for us, but he's really been focused in recent years on the garden ecosystem and biodiversity, turning turf areas into wildflower areas, really thinking about how he cuts back and doesn't cut back garden areas for really creating a habitat for insects and pollinators and other garden critters. So those of you who are joining me for this will really be interested in his topic. But we've also got some other folks, Stephen Barstow, who is in Norway, who is all about edible plants. He's does some fascinating talks and work on what he calls edimentals, edible ornamentals. So really excited about that. And then we've got great folks from all over the US and NC State. You can go to our website and look at that and register. It's going to be a great day, and it will be recorded for all those who register for it. So you will get a link if you register for it. If you don't know that you'll be able to spend a whole day sitting in front of your computer, you'll be able to enjoy it in pieces, if you will. Okay, so this week I'm going to talk to you about some pollinator plants. I'm going to talk about maybe some more non-traditional pollinator plants. I kind of had to build and reconstructed this talk a couple times because I realized I was getting too far over into making your garden welcoming for pollinators and other beneficials and less really focusing on the plants themselves. So I went back and retooled it to really talk more about the plants. But I'm gonna talk about some overarching concepts as well as I go through this. So as always, feel free to put your questions in the chat. And as we go along, we've got Chris and other staff are standing by and will answer what they can. They'll hold the questions that they're not sure about to the end. Sometimes they'll break in and ask me questions, ask me clarification, but please just type your questions in there. And if we don't get it, if you feel like we've missed it at the end, sometimes we get a lot in the chat. At the end, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it in the chat again. And I'll be, happy to, when we get to the end, I'll be happy to discuss with people who have different opinion than me, because that will likely happen, at least to some extent, because there's a lot of misinformation that's out there or incomplete information. And so this is what I'm talking about is very much based in both science and experience. So we'll go from there. So the first thing I want to mention is a lot of the pictures that I will be that I'll show have, bees in them, honeybees, that sort of thing. And honeybees are great. We need them. But really, when I'm talking about pollinators, I'm talking about kind of the whole range of pollinators, especially our native bees and wasps and flies and all the little guys that help pollinate the plants that we have. Honeybees aren't native to North America, which is fine, but they're more photogenic than a lot of the other critters. So we tend to have more photos of the bees, since I take all these images from my photos and other staff and volunteers from the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. So just a word there that when I'm talking about pollinators, I'm talking about them kind of writ large, not so much like butterflies. Butterflies are pretty pollinators, but they're not very good, not very effective pollinators when you compare them to the bee family and other wasps and flies. And, I will mention right up front that while I'm going to be talking about plants for pollinators, and I'm really mostly going to be talking about flowering plants for pollinators, because I am talking more about bees than I am about, say, butterflies. So I'm not really going to be talking really about larval food for caterpillars, because the bees, that's what the nectar and pollen is for, is to go back and feed their young. But I will say that these insects do need habitat, whether that's a bee house like we have here at the Arboretum, or it's some areas of the ground that you don't clean up come wintertime, some areas of the garden. These like little reeds we have in the bee houses, those mimic the old stems of like grasses and perennials that some of these solitary bees will overwinter in. But if you make everything clean and pristine every fall going into winter, you're really getting rid of a lot of the overwintering pollinators. So that habitat is important, more important perhaps even during winter than it is during summer. So you do want to make sure about that. All right. You don't have to read all this, but this is just from one study. There are a lot of them out there where they're looking at differences between native and non-native pollinator-friendly plant species. And from this research, what they found was that the number of bees and the number of types of bees were similar at native and non-native plantings, or lower at the native stands than the non-native plots. So you see, this is just one study that's showing that native, non-native is not really what we should be thinking about. And I hear people say, well, they co-evolved, and so the native bees really need our native species. Those are better. And to those people, I say, look at what you eat. If you just ate what was around, what was native around you, your diet wouldn't be nearly as good. When you look at plants in terms of evolution and relationships, there's a reason that Asia and Eastern North America, the plants grow so well, from East Asia grow so well here. It's because it's a similar climate, and also because at one point we were connected, and as continents drifted apart, the plants evolved in different ways. But there's a reason why there are so many of the same species of plants in both places. And same thing with insects. So yes, there are some very highly co-evolved flowers and insects that really one can't function without the other. But in general, it's size and shape of the flower, not exactly what it is. And if you don't believe me, I can, this is just a small listing of other research that speaks to the same thing, that nativity is not nearly as important as diversity in terms of plants for pollinators. And I may have shown this in another talk to you before, but this is the first page from when we had our honey from our honeybees. Again, honeybees, not native bees, but still one can be used as kind of to get insight into the other. We had our honey analyzed at Texas A&M, and so they go through the pollen counts. And when you look at that, you see, over 10% comes from maple, over 20% from roost. That's poison ivy, sumacs, probably some of the other Anacardiaceae like pistachios that are growing nearby the Arboretum, if not in there, willows, So this is a snapshot in time. If we were to take honey that was produced, so we got this result in mid-May. If we did this in November, we would get different pollen in there. But you see, when Texas A&M gets a honey sample, what their typical is to get almost completely one type of pollen, almost 50% one type of pollen. So like when you buy clary sage pollen or honey, it's over 45% of this. We had almost nothing that even is in the secondary. We have one thing, the rose family, which is a whole lot of plants, and they separated out Prunus. So that's up in that secondary pollen type. Most of it is important in the minor pollen types in here. And what I always emphasize to people, what you got to remember from this, and this is what I hope everybody takes away from this, is that it is less about this plant or that plant. It's more about plant diversity. I mean, look at this. We even have crepe myrtles in here at 2.5%. That almost gets it into the important minor pollen area. So keep that in mind when people start telling you these pollinators don't like this or pollinators do like that. And one of the reasons that maple is so high on ours, especially at this time, is because the maples had just finished blooming. And here you got in the middle, this is our native red maple, Acer rubrum, the big plant. It's a beautiful plant in flower. It can be gorgeous. But then we also have things like this Acer truncatum with these nice yellow flowers. And this is just our Japanese maple, the symbol of the J.C. Ralston Arboretum, Acer palmatum. This one looks like Higasayama. These are beautiful flowering plants, and they rely on insects to pollinate them. So if you're getting seed on your Japanese maple or any other type of maple, it's because insects are visiting it. They won't form seed if they're not getting that pollen moving from one flower to another. So, these are important plants. That's 10% out of our honey. And let me tell you, we had healthy bees. We pull pollen off of I keep saying that. We pull honey off of the hives all winter because there's so much pollen, so much nectar for the insects, because they're visiting our plants year round. We always have something in flower here at the Arboretum, so there's always a food source for them. Willows, another one that was big on that list. Whether that's on the right, you have one of the larger tree, weeping willow type willows, but also the shrubby ones like the red-budded woody pussy willow, Salix canameloides. We have native ones. These pussy willows are great. And a lot of times we grow them for the shrubby ones for cut stems to bring inside during the winter to get these flowering, these little bushy pussy willows on there. But you always want to make sure you leave a bunch out there for the insects. Now, if you don't want them to get big and you want to keep them cut back, just wait till after they flower and cut them back and let them grow out through the growing season and set buds for the following year, because these are very important nectar sources. And it doesn't matter whether there are native willows or they are non-native ones. The pollinators utilize them really well. So I've kind of put these in here rather than try and group them in some other way. I'm going through the year because this is what I want to emphasize to everybody, is that we need things in flower all year. So many pollinator gardens that I see are all plants that flower from mid-spring to early fall. And we need flowers. If you're central North Carolina or anywhere warmer, we need flowers flowering all year through, because we have insects that are active, pollinators that are active all season. Now, yes, they're most active during the summer, but when it's 70 degrees in January and February, they do utilize these plants. So you take camellias. Camellias are great pollinator plants. The thing with all of these that you want to remember is, if you start getting into the really double flowered camellias, anemone types that have the petaloids in the center, most often when a flower is double, this is kind of a semi-double, but when it's fully double, a lot of the reproductive parts the stamens and the pistils have been converted to petals or petaloids. And when that happens, they're not producing the nectar, the pollen that your pollinators need. So the single and semi-double flowered camellias are really what you want to go for. And really, you can get camellias that are in flower from early fall through mid-spring if you choose the right selections. Another great one for spring, and one that was a favorite of Dr. J.C. Ralston, our namesake here, is Prunus Mumei, the Japanese flowering apricot, or ume. If you didn't catch our Deeper in the Garden with on ume, you can find that on our channel on Facebook as well. Prunus Mumei is a great winter flowering tree, typically in the most flower in January and February. Again, this is another one that there are a lot of double flowered forms, but you want to make sure you get a form that is either single flowered or semi-double, but still has all those stamens in there, so there is pollen on there. If you look at this plant, at this bee, you can see all the pollen that's on there, and that's all coming from this plant. Bees tend to really work one plant and not bounce around from one type of plant to another type of plant. So he's really been gathering that pollen. And this is a picture taken in January. This is in Raleigh. This bee is active. This plant is flowering. Prunus Mumei is also delightful because it's flowering in January and February when it's cold outside, and it's got this kind of warm, spicy, clovey, sweet scent. It's really beautiful. And you can get it in white, in light pink, in kind of this rose pink, deeper pink, to really almost true red. And it can be there are dwarf ones and contorted ones and weeping ones and upright ones. So really you can find something that fits your landscape with a Prunus Mumei. And we know how much the pollinators love prunus. We wouldn't have apples and pears and plums, cherries, if we didn't have insects pollinating our prunus and other rose family crops. And this is just another one of those type plants. Another in that same family, the rose family, that stretches from midwinter on into spring, is the flowering quince, Schnommeles. This is Schnommeles superba mandarin, a really nice red-orange one. This is, I think this one's Schnommeles, looks like Toya Nishiki. Schnommeles, I think that's Toya Nishiki, which has kind of bicolored pink and white flowers. You can get little dwarf ones, Pygmaea, and other dwarf flowering quinces. You can get them whites and pinks and oranges and reds and kind of all those really beautiful colors, flowering when not much else is. They leaf out, then they kind of don't look like a whole lot during the rest of the growing season, but they're great for the pollinators early on. This is another one that you have to look out for, double flowered forms. The ones, if I were typically talking to you just about flowering quince and which ones to get, I would point you towards the double take series, which are thornless. You can see the thorns, spines on there. The double take series are really showy and thornless, but they're double flowered and you don't have as much nectar and pollen. So probably not as good for creating pollinator gardens as others. Sassafras, whether it's our native sassafras or the Chinese Sassafras zumu, it's another one that comes out kind of midwinter into spring. Gorgeous, gorgeous plant. It's typically this species and genus is typically dioecious, meaning they're separate male and female plants. Our plant, which you can see here on the right, was never formed fruit, and I never saw male flower parts on it, just female flower parts on it, up until a handful of years ago. And then it started putting out perfect flowers with both male and female parts on it. So, we're now getting crops of seed on this, which we wouldn't get if the bee wasn't moving them around. Typically, you'd want multiple trees, but we're not sure quite what's made our plant decide to flower, have both male and female flower parts, but it's fantastic because it's such a gorgeous plant. And we don't think about these big trees, larger trees, as pollinator plants, but another great native pollinator plant is our native tulip poplar, Liriodendron tulipifera. Didn't put it in here, but that is a really good pollinator plant. Another good native is our native snowbell or silverbell, excuse me. This is Florida silverbell. Halesia diptera, variety magniflora, the large flowered two-winged silverbell or Florida silverbell, blooms in spring with these white flowers kind of as the leaves are emerging. Big bell-shaped flowers, incredibly showy plant. And the bees, whether they're our native pollinators or imported honeybees and others, all seem to really, really like this plant while it's in flower. And the other Halesias as well. So there's the Halesia tetraptera, and that the bees like. And my guess is the Asian Halesia mcgregori as well is a good pollinator plant. I'm mostly talking about woody plants today, but I will mention I have a few non-woody plants like the pasque flower, pulsatilla. Most of these are European and into the Middle East. You see this one, Pulsatilla georgica, from the country of Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. Another great little plant. And you can see this is one of our little native solitary bees, not the honeybees. And they get in there and they love all that pollen, produces a lot of nectar, and this is, another great little plant for them. Beautiful as well in a well-drained site. Quite a few different pulsatillas we grow. Now, our native dogwood, Cornus florida, flowering dogwood, is a good pollinator plant, but somewhat under-recognized and certainly underutilized is one of my absolute all-time favorite native trees, and that's the Pagoda Dogwood, Cornus alternifolia. This is the other native tree dogwood to North Carolina. And it makes kind of a small to medium understory tree, very layered, kind of tiered habit, usually represented in gardens by its variegated form, Argentea or variegata, which has white variegated leaves. I like the variegated one. I like this one. There's a great gold variegated one called William Stackman. Right, can't remember what its trade name is, but no matter what, you're getting these clusters of small white flowers that are kind of the perfect size for pollinators, and they'll pollinate it, and the plant will form little black berries that the birds love. I would say they're showy, except for they never seem to stay on my tree long enough for me to really enjoy it. But if you're growing that and you want something different, there are, like I mentioned, there are variegated ones, there are gold edged ones. There's this gold bullion, which is, you can talk about a screaming plant in the landscape. And here it is in full flower. The bees are not going to miss this thing when it's in full leaf with gold, but then it has those flowers. And this thing, it looked like when I saw it, it was like a haze, and it was just covered with pollinators. Now, I will say this picture was not taken in Raleigh. This picture was taken in the UK. And guess what? The UK pollinators loved our native plant. And so if we can do that, we can take a plant with, look at our native dogwood with that size and shape of flower, and look at, say, one of the Asian equivalents of it, Cornus macrophylla, which is big leaf dogwood, which is a bigger tree than Cornus alternifolia, but has the same size and shape of flower. And guess what? Our pollinators love this just as much as they love our native Cornus alternifolia. Flowers for a longer season than Cornus alternifolia does, which really end of April into June. It's kind of a quick flowering guy, but Cornus macrophylla or Cornus controversa is another large Asian dogwood with these same type of flowers. One we just released from the Arboretum, Cornus wilsoniana, white jade. Again, these same, it's the same size and shape of the flowers, as well as some of the shrubby dogwoods, which I didn't include here, but the Cornus, the red and yellow twig dogwoods, both our native shrubby dogwoods with these flat clusters of flowers, as well as the European and Asian ones. All are great pollinator plants, actually better pollinator plants than our native flowering dogwood or Kusa dogwoods, because there are so many more, there's much more pollen and nectar in these plants, in these flower clusters, than you get in the Kusa and our native flowering dogwood. What about cactus? Cactus need love too. And while we think of them as southwestern plants, desert plants, there are cacti that are native to North Carolina, like Opuntia humifusa. And, you know, insects pollinate our native Opuntias. So if you take ones from other areas, from Mexico and the desert Southwest, and you grow them, ones, you know, whatever, whether it's Opuntia alta or otherwise, you know, the pollinators love them. Look at these bees, but they just, I mean, look at all the pollen that's in there. That bee's just having a good old time. It's like rolling in, you know, it's like in movies when people roll around in money or whatever, throw it up in the air and roll around the bed and money, you know, that's what it's doing. It's just covered with pollen. And every Opuntia that I've seen had been a great pollinator plant. And the colors you get white, yellows, you get reds, oranges, kind of bicolors, pinks. The colors are so richly saturated and beautiful. They're great garden plants. I don't like gardening too much personally with prickly plants, but you know, it's hard to beat them when they're in flower. I mean, it's pretty showy. And then you can eat the fruits as well. You know, I was talking about edimentals. This is one that, you know, you can eat those fruits. You can eat the pads if you clean them off and get all those prickles out. But great pollinator plants, and ones you don't have to worry about. Put them in a pot instead of the ground. And that way, when they start getting too big, you just break off a bunch of the pads, give them to your friends or whatever, but you can go away for 3 weeks on vacation and not worry about whether it rains or not if you're growing these. And we got some natives that people really don't grow very much, like Deervilla. There are a couple of species of Deervilla sessilifolia and Deervilla rivularis, native plants, sometimes called southern bush honeysuckle. Has more to do with their relationship to honeysuckle than how they look. This is a variegated one called Cool Splash. There's a great one called Troja Black that's got dark leaves. But even just the species is kind of a nice, you know, for sun to shade, kind of a shrub with these small flowers. It's not a beautiful flowering shrub. It won't, you know, they don't show up that well, but look at these little native pollinators on there. A little guy sticking his head in there. That's some other different genera of pollinator. You know, they really like this plant, and it's flowering at that same time as a lot of other pollinator plants that you see in the typical list, but you don't often see these Deervilla in there, and we should. Probably the tree at the Arboretum that gets the most activity when it's in flower is the Tetradium. This genus really, but this tree, Tetradium baberi, it, like on giving tours, this tree is no longer there, but it used to be, if I were standing near there talking about something else while this was in flower, you know, people had to get closer to me to hear, because the hum of all the buzzing of all the insects, and it is just all kinds of different things here when this is in flower, just tremendous. It's pretty good fall color too. It's interesting fruit. Unfortunately, this species suckers like mad, and so it'll pop up 10 feet away. So probably best to grow in a lawn area where you're mowing over any suckers that come up rather than in a garden. But you know, I've only seen one tree that rivals this in terms of the diversity of pollinators that visits it, and that's one that I meant to put in here, but I didn't. It's our native Cyrilla racemiflora, or TT tree, is another incredible pollinator plant. A different native, our Cephalanthus button bush, grows in boggy areas, wet areas, flowers for a relatively short time with these, Sputnik flowers. Don't know if we still have our COVID-19 2020 shirts for sale, but might have a few that'll be available to people once we're selling plants and selling shirts and things again on site. But you see it's got these starburst flowers, and both like pollinators like bees and wasps love these things, but also moths and butterflies really like it. They've got tubular flowers, but they're not so long tubular that they're only good for butterflies. It's really great, but its sister plant, cousin plant from Asia, Adena rubella, has the same type of flowers, and both butterflies and other types of pollinators like bees love the plant, and it flowers for a much longer period than our native button bush typically does. And it's a much more refined shrub. It's, our native button bush can be a bit of an ugly sucker when it's not in flower sometimes. Not always, sometimes it's beautiful, but often it's kind of I would call it a second tier plant when it's not in flower. But Adena is gorgeous, gorgeous in foliage. And this is one that's got kind of a little bit of a purple tint to the foliage and the flowers as well. Phenomenal. And what about bananas? Certainly don't think of bananas as pollinator plants, but if you have one that flowers early enough to be in flower here, which the tropical bananas and subtropical bananas often don't flower for us, but this pink banana, Musa velutina, always flowers. And when it's in flower, you will always see bees in here digging down through here to get at the nectar. Sometimes you'll get some, I don't know if they're insects or birds that kind of chew through on the back end to get into all the nectar that's in there, because they're just loaded with nectar. And you see, if it gets pollinated, you get some little bananas in there, some pink fruited bananas. Here in Raleigh, this is hardy in Raleigh and produces fruit in Raleigh. It's one of the few reliable fruiting species for zone 7B. And it keeps going right into October and up to a freeze, which is important. Same with gingers, the flowering ginger. We think of these as very tropical looking plants, those super fragrant flowers, but insects love these things. So do hummingbirds. I haven't really talked about hummingbirds, focusing on the pollinators that are disappearing, but there's a wide variety that will take really almost any of the ginger lilies will attract pollinators. Perhaps not as good as some of the other ones, but there's a lot going on out in the garden in August and September that is good, like goldenrods and asters and things like that. Pretty much any flower, any plant with that daisy type flower, so purple cone flower, asters, sunflowers, helianthus, all of those types of things are great for pollinators as well. But you see those often. So I'm looking at some of the other plants. Sanguisorba. The bees love this guy, and it gets, the flowers kind of float in the wind above the plant on this thing. And there are a lot of different Sanguisorbas, all of them great pollinator plants. And I started with a camellia, and you have camellias that bring you in, through the end of the season. This is the tea camellia, Camellia sinensis. Again, look at that bee. Look at how much pollen it's carrying. If this isn't doing some pollination, I don't know what is. And the Sasanqua camellias start in the spring and take you in through December. So you really can have plants all year. And Fatsia. This is one that I was excited this year because we had a different species of Fatsia than Fatsia japonica in full flower this year, while Fatsia japonica was in flower. So I'm hoping that some of these bees did their job and went from Fatsia japonica to our Fatsia polycarpa, and we're going to have some hybrids between the two based on the bees. But October can be, and even November can be brutally hot here in North Carolina. So having these plants that are flowering in that season, but we have, we can have a frost that could kill off all those herbaceous things that we're planting, we've planted in the fall for pollinators. And, and then have a 80-degree day in late October, November, and all the pollinators will be out and moving and looking for food. And we need to make sure it's there. And Mahonias, which get a bad rap, but they are flowering when we need food for our pollinators often. Depending on the type of Mahonia, it may be anywhere from August through March that they're flowering, and they are great for pollinators. The bees and such just love them. So, you want to be careful. Some of them can be weedy, but a lot of the hybrids and more unusual species don't tend to seed like the old Mahonia bealii, the leatherleaf Mahonia, which can be a problem. So what I want you to remember from all this is not necessarily the plants that I showed you. I really shy away from when people want lists of pollinator plants. And I really tell people, do not worry about what you're planting. Just don't, but plant a diversity of things. Increasing plant diversity on your property to help bees forage all through the season. If you leave some areas undisturbed over the winter, well, all year round, if you leave some undisturbed sites, that helps them for nesting, because they do need that for nesting. This is a chart here is from a study on the effects of plant diversity on pollinator abundance. So one was a pollinator planting that was strictly, native plants that had been that were specifically called out on multiple lists as good for pollinator gardens. This second one is an ornamental planting that was as diverse in terms of different types of flowers as this one that was specifically for pollinators. But this was an existing garden that was not planted as a pollinator planting, but just as a nice flower garden. And this is a typical suburban yard that's dominated by turf. And what you find is that there is no statistically significant difference between the pollinator planting and the ornamental planting. However, there is with that typical suburban yard. So we need to reduce the turf, and we need to increase the diversity of our planting. You can call it a pollinator planting, but you don't need to. If it's pretty to you, it is probably going to be good for pollinators, because pretty flowers, they're pretty so to attract pollinators. That is by default, that is why those flowers are pretty. Things that have pretty ugly flowers, like, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but say pines and oaks, which don't have very showy flowers, they're the reason that spring can be so miserable in North Carolina, because they all release a just gargantuan amount of pollen, and it relies on the wind moving it around to pollinate other pines or oaks. Whereas plants with showier flowers, the pollinators are what is moving that pollen around. So I'm going to stop my share right there, because I know that I often get a lot of questions when it comes to pollinators, and sometimes I get a lot of pushback.
We had a really big group today, Mark. Almost hit the maximum capacity, which of course is awesome. I have gotten many of the questions, if not all of them. So I'm just going to ask everyone that if I missed something, let's just go ahead and answer it again, because the chat was, or ask it again, because the chat was very active and it's a long list. So let's just go ahead and ask them again.
Yeah, ask me again.
So we can see them more easily. Mark, someone did ask to show that initial chart, the one I think with all the different percentages of the different pollen in the honey. If you can show that one while we're just kind of chit-chatting for a little bit.
Yep.
And someone asked about, and I missed the name, unfortunately, the tree that rivals the BB tree, the Tetradium.
Cyrilla racemiflora.
Okay. That's what I was wondering if it was.
Cyrilla.
And someone mentioned that that one can be toxic to honeybees as well.
The Cyrilla?
Yeah.
Could be. I'm trying to remember if I've ever seen honeybees on it. I have not. That I can
I've seen
think
wasps
of.
on it.
It usually has, yeah, it's usually just a lot of the solitary bees.
Yes.
Yeah, so and somebody's mentioned crimson clover. Clover is a great plant, but I want you to look on this list. I'm glad I went back to it. You look at like trifolium, that type of clover, 1%. And mellilotus, 3.5% as compared to maple, spruce, willow, so you're really looking in the same range as crepe myrtles on that. Now, part of that is because we don't grow a lot of clover here, so it is what is around that the insects go to. But my point is, if you have a lot of clover and it all flowers at once and then it's gone and there's no other food, then they're missing out. So if you focus too much on what the best plant is, unless it's flowering 12 months of the year, you're missing out on things. Crimson clover is flowering a lot when other things are not blooming, for sure. So I'm not saying anything against any of these other plants. I'm just saying, for most people, focusing on diversity is better than focusing on individual genera. But this recording will be uploaded to YouTube for sure. Mimosa is a great pollinator plant. Exactly, that is a great one. I don't really think of it as a problem plant for much. It's a quick successional plant, so it'll seed around in a sunny garden, but it won't infiltrate the woods. Good place to find Pagoda Dogwoods. I believe we will have Pagoda Dogwoods for sale in the fall. I think we have brought in liners to grow out for the fall. You can often get the variegated ones, but it's hard to find the green leaf ones out there.
Someone asked earlier, Mark, about the pagoda. Is that a good one for zone 8?
Yeah.
Paul that out towards Wilmington and may not grow as well.
Oh man, no, I grew that in Norfolk with no problem at all. It was great out there.
Great.
Yeah. Do pollinators prefer red and yellow blooms? Is that so? As a general rule, hummingbirds really prefer reds, whereas a lot of other pollinators are attracted more to yellow, but they'll go to other color flowers for sure. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Well, a lot of white flowering things are great with pollinators.
The BB tree you talked about and the TT are both white.
Yeah.
And bees do see in different wavelengths, and there's different patterns in flowers when you look at them underneath UV light. UV or infrared, I can't remember which one. I think it's infrared.
Yeah. Yeah, some of you mentioned about Echinacea. A lot of the double Echinaceas are not very good. If you go to the Mount Cuba Center website, they just did a phenomenal cultivar trial of coneflowers, of Echinacea. And one of the things that they rated them on was pollinators. And so these are all plants that are out there. Somebody said that they heard in general that hybrids produce less pollen. That's a generalization that is not necessarily true. It can be true, I guess, in general. Maybe if you put that in big, couple sets of quotes, that might work. Anything else? Let me ask about windmill palms, which have a lot of flowers in April. Yeah, windmill palms, Trachycarpus fortunii, those do attract pollinators. I'm not sure exactly which ones it attracts, but I do see a lot of activity around palms. So I don't know. There you go. Flies. Yeah, I've never looked that closely. So somebody put on there, Frida says they attract flies, and flies can be great pollinators. So
I have a private message over here. Someone was asking about Glory Bauer being used as a pollinator plant. I'm not familiar with Glory Bauer as a common name, unfortunately.
Glory Bauer can be a few different things, but usually you're talking about
Bleeding heart?
Clerodendron.
Yeah, okay.
Clerodendron bungii and Clerodendron trichotomum. Both are great pollinator plants. Those are ones that Clerodendron bungii is kind of more of a shrubby kind of plant, about 4 feet tall with beautiful cluster of pink, purpley rose flowers. I don't know my colors, but it spreads by rhizomes very, very quickly. And Clerodendron trichotomum can sucker quite a bit as well. Yeah, Marianne Debsky says mountain mint, pink Nanthemum is a hit in the yard. That's one of the best pollinator plants around, but that's why I'm talking about non-traditional pollinator plants. Yeah, Nandina does, Vitex, Agnes castus does. Yeah, there are a lot of, and that's the ultimate thing is there are so many plants that work, and they work for different things. There are a lot of these little solitary bees that look like little small flies that you don't even notice on your plants, and you don't think of them as pollinators, but they are. And there are native plants that we have that flower down at the ground level, like asarum, our native acerums or native wild gingers that are pollinated by bees and beetles that crawl along the ground to get to them. We have native erasemas, which are pollinated by flies, that smell bad. So, so they attract things like that. So again, plant lots of beautiful things, don't plant too many of the double flowered forms. Probably are better to plant more of the old fashioned form. I don't talk about annuals really in this, but watch the annuals you buy. If annuals with showy flowers, in order to get seed, they really need to be pollinated if they were growing in the wild. If you are growing a lot of these things and you're not seeing many pollinators on them, like if you're growing zinnias or dahlias or marigolds or something like that, and you're not seeing many pollinators, I wouldn't grow that same variety the next time around. I would try something different, because a lot of times in breeding, that is something that is lost, is the nectar and pollen production. Is there a way to have local pollen analyzed? Yes, you can send your pollen to the Texas A&M lab. It really, the lab was set up to analyze pollen from archaeological sites, like things found in, Egyptian pyramids, that kind of thing, or in native burial mounds. But they moved into the honey business. So you can, if you have honey from somewhere around you can have that sent in to see.
So there's another question about where to buy plants, and I know you've covered some sources, Mark, and even mentioned our fall plant sale might be having some of those. But just as a reminder to everyone, ask your local nursery if they don't have a particular plant to get one for you. These nurseries often have a lot of sources and a lot of abilities to bring in plants. They just don't stock every single thing, because that's a whole lot of availability that they can get, and they just don't have enough room. But if they have a special request, that's a guaranteed sale. They're usually more than happy to get it for you. So if you have a specific one, just ask your nursery for it.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, so you mentioned Debbie Roos. She's great. She's got a lot of great information. There's 2 researchers here at NC State have just released a book on pollinator gardens. I kind of fought with them over the title, but because I don't like that. But what they will tell you is nativity there's no good research showing that where a plant is native to is nearly as important as the size and shape of the flower. Are there companion plants for pawpaws to attract flies? I don't know, but now you're getting a little farther beyond my knowledge. I assume that by companion, what is meant is plants that are blooming at other times of the years that the flies that pollinate the pawpaws can go to during other times of the year. Somebody asked where they can buy pear trees. Go to your garden center. I hope by pear trees you mean edible pears and not calorie pears, because you don't want to plant those. Those are super weedy. Any other questions? If something didn't get answered early on, please type it again.
Yeah, Paul just mentioned or reminded us that plant availability might be tight this year because, of course, so many people are gardening. I was at Plant Delights on Saturday, and I've never seen as many empty shelves as I have at that place before.
Yeah, plant availability is a real issue this year, so which is good and bad. Good that people are buying plants, but don't want to run out. I did say that we might have Pagoda Dogwoods for sale this fall. Mm-hmm. I get this, I don't know if this is a question or what, but why, I guess it is, why are native pollinators flying around in winter if we must plant for them? I'm assuming that question is saying, if they're native pollinators and they're around in winter, why do we need to plant for them? We've got to plant for them because we've denuded so much of their habitat that the only way we're going to be able to keep pollinators going is by making our landscapes pollinator friendly. And there isn't enough native habitat left. So I mentioned, one other thing I did not mention at the beginning is if you want pollinators, don't spray. Don't get mosquito spray, spraying, Mosquito Joe spray in your yard. Don't spray chemicals on all your plants. Don't spray a bunch of roses. Somebody said they wish that I would embrace natives as well. As I love natives, and there are a whole bunch of natives on my talk, in this talk. A bunch of those were native. I love natives. I just am looking at talking about garden plants and ones that are not in most lists. So, go back to where I was with the spraying. If you plant a diversity of plants, you should have to do less spraying because, there are less problems. How do you keep bugs off roses, keep them around for pollinators? Don't plant a whole bunch of roses all together because they're disease magnets and insect magnets. And when you do get a bunch of Japanese beetles all over them, cut the stems back, bag them up with all the Japanese beetles on there. Do it early in the morning when the Japanese beetles are all asleep on there, and let them reflush and flower again for the fall. So wait, real quick, Pamela Haddon, who said you have no idea maples gave off so much pollen. Again, they are pollinated. They rely on bees and insects to move that pollen. So maples are not releasing all of that pollen like pines and our Atlantic white cedar and junipers and oaks do. The pollinators actually go to the maple flowers. I always tell people, if it has a showy flower, and maples do, even though people don't realize it, generally you don't have to worry about the pollen you don't have to worry about having problems with the pollen. Seeding flowers are great. Keep roses off. Yeah, we will, Chris just reminded me, we will have a pop-up plant sale next Thursday from 3 until 7 at the Arboretum. And these are it's a spring cleaning. It's some odds and ends from out of our nursery that we want to get out of there. Maggie made a note that bees typically collect only one type of pollen in their collecting trip. So yeah, that's planting multiples, especially of shrubs. The bigger trees are big enough to really take a lot for a lot of bees to really work at one time. Where are the restrictions and information on invasive exotics? I'm not, Lana, you're gonna have to ask me more. There's a lot of information, not all of it correct, but online about invasive exotics. We try and keep people well informed on where if a plant has the potential to be invasive in some places, and really trying to differentiate between garden thugs and invasive. But feel free to reach out to me directly if you want more information on that. So the sale is Thursday, May 20th, not tomorrow, Thursday, May 20th, 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Is there a presentation on what plants you can plant together that help each other stay happy? Happy and healthy is a question. Not a presentation that I can give, other than some plants that really affect the health of others, like black walnuts and things. I've never had problems with plants working well together. So I just don't know. I don't have that information. If somebody put a note on here about the North Carolina Native Plant Society, it's a great group. Love them to death. They often have great diseases. Fend off diseases. I still don't have great information on that, honestly. My experience at botanic gardens and in my own gardening is the more diversity you have, the less problem you have with diseases. It's as simple as that. The more of one type of thing you have, then the more chance that the disease can build up to be a really bad thing, or more plants can be affected. Whereas if you have a lot of diversity and a disease hits something, well, cut it back or get rid of it, and other plants are there to be in the fold. Yeah, garlic might work. Garlic and all the onions, all the alliums are great pollinator plants as well. So all the both ornamental and edible onions. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. And if ever I answer a question and don't answer it very well, feel free to reach out to me directly via email, and we'll be happy to go into more depth as I can.
Thank you so very much, Mark. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. It was nice to see you online.
Thank you all. It was great to see everybody.
Thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Mark.
Pleasure.
And you too, Chris.
Oh, always happy to help.
Thanks, fellas.
Some
Delightful.
great questions. That was a lot of fun.